I've received more than a few questions about how I got into writing horror, and I've realised that perhaps the best answer is also a story itself. I had quite a few run-ins with the inexplicable when I was younger. I always loved scary stories and ate up any horror show I was allowed to watch. This later translated into a subtle disappointment and a feeling of betrayal as I reached my teenage years without personally ever seeing anything terrifying. That changed when we moved. We'd always lived on the East Coast near the Appalachian Mountains. The mountains were blue on the horizon, and the land was hilly and massively forested. I grew up completely used to wandering in the woods. It was all moderately civilized landscape. That was simply the nature of cities in the foothills. The Midwest was completely the opposite. The American Midwest, at least around here, could probably be characterized best as a dichotomy. Suburbs were built in tight formation, with landscaped lawns and pretty streets. Meanwhile, right outside the outer circle of houses, drawn around the area almost like a wagon train circled for safety, there immediately began completely unkempt forest. In our neighbourhood, we called that abrupt back end to our neighbourhood the Edge. Around the age of 14, we fancied ourselves far too old to be scared of anything, but that sudden divide between trimmed civilization and dark forest still fascinated and terrified us. There was a house back there too, a mile or two back. Left over from some past era, it was well known in the neighbourhood as haunted. Besides a purported aura of intense fear it gave off, its primary claim to fame was a strange sound that could only be heard while inside. We resolved to enter that house and figure out once and for all the mystery of that sound. It was 7th grade, and I, having just moved, was in a new school that I hated. My only friends were the other outcasts. There was Hans, the German kid who spoke English with a thick accent, Chris, who was permanently sarcastic and annoying, and our token weird girl Caitlin, who, according to rumour, picked her nose often and once ate it. Misfits was an apt term for our group. And then there was me. Too smart for my own good, just cool enough to know how cool I wasn't, and more than a little angry at life in general. I was every teenager ever, now that I think about it. We crept across the edge in the middle of the afternoon. We weren't stupid enough to try it at night. Compared to my old home, the forest itself was different too. Instead of massive old-growth trees with plenty of space underneath and a nice carpet of leaves, this forest was more moderate in height and much more tangled. This was not something a person could just walk around in. Worse, the middle of Ohio was rife with sudden sheer canyons for some ancient geological reason. Our parents had often regaled us with tales of the kids who fell in and died, 1 or 2 a year, if their exaggerations were to be believed. So we crept through the tangled underbrush with double apprehension. Passage was annoying enough that once we reached the house, we could have given ourselves excuses and gone home, but we didn't. This was potentially our ticket to some measure of popularity. The house sat at an odd angle, surrounded by slightly younger trees and thick undergrowth. 4 holly trees flanked the front, 2 on each side of the main steps. The porch looked disturbingly like a mouth, and the front door sat ajar. We looked at each other for several minutes, daring one another to be the first, until a sudden drizzle forced our collective hand. We sought the porch for shelter from the surprise rain. "Yeah, that makes this way less scary," Chris commented, gazing up at the wall of rain sliding down from the house's roof. The patter of rain on leaves reminded me of home, but the accompanying gloom made the house that much darker. I peered in through the dusty front windows but saw nothing. Caitlin peered in another window, apprehensive. "Boys first," Caitlin said. Hans just frowned and pushed the front door. Surprisingly, it swung in without resistance or sound. The interior of the house sat like 2 dark plains above and below a dim haze of dust. The rain outside had the whole place pattering, creaking and breathing. I was rather eloquent back then. "This sucks," I muttered. Nobody argued the point. We crept in at a snail's pace, testing each placed foot as if something might leap out at us at any moment. Once all 4 of us were inside, Hans let the door swing silently shut, and we froze, listening. The ebb and flow of the rain blanketed us with a current of sound. We heard a creak upstairs, and then came a creak near the dust-covered sofa in the room to our left. Riding adrenaline, it almost seemed a good idea to bolt. Before we made the collective decision to leave, there it was. "It's like being at the movies," Caitlin whispered, "and the theatre next to yours starts rumbling and shaking." Her description was the best way to put it. The house vibrated slightly, and a spike in the rumbling actually shook dust from the rafters above. Shaking my head to get the dust out of my hair, I crept forward. Following the rumble, the sound brought me to a gaping black door. Of course, the basement. Unhappily, we clustered around the stairs to the basement. Deeper gloom lit the base of the stairs, filtering through from the small basement windows we'd seen from outside. "After you," Chris said. Making a face, I stepped carefully down, testing each wooden board. The structure itself seemed solid, even if I couldn't see it. I kept calm by telling myself they could see my silhouette against the basement's dim light and would get help if they saw me fall. I froze at the base of the stairs. The rumbling was louder here, like distant thunder. I could feel a subtle vibration in my legs whenever the rolling murmur reached a crescendo. I noticed all that subconsciously, but it was what I saw that had me locked in place. Filtering swathes of dusty light fell through countless sharp objects. 3 pitchforks over there, old harvesting equipment with a roll of curved spines across from it, a goddamn bear trap on the wall, rusty shovels, hung machetes. Every piece of ancient farm equipment imaginable lay around at unpredictable angles. A hand grabbed my shoulder. "How's it look?" Chris asked, hunched over against the cobwebs we'd passed through. He looked around. "Oh, shnikey." He jumped as Caitlin bumped into him and Hans came up behind her. "This looks dangerous," Caitlin said. I agreed, but I hated it here, in the city, the whole place. I wasn't about to let some creepy house scare me off, especially not when the danger was completely mundane, as always. I wanted to be scared, wanted to run from a ghost, and I'd always been let down. "We'll just be careful," I said, moving forward. "The sound's closer here. Nobody's ever said anything about this basement, so we know we're further than they've ever been. Let's leave. Take this discovery. It's already good for us," Hans said, concerned. I looked back at him with a glare and shook my head before moving forward again. Caitlin moved past Chris and held onto my shoulder as I moved. "It sounds like the ocean." "Yeah, it does," I replied, wondering if that was significant. I carefully slid around a jagged series of tools that had fallen from a rotting shelf. But that whole aura of fear thing the other kids talk about, there's none of that. Just this basement full of rusted crap. Working their own way through the expansive, gloomy maze of rusty danger, Hans and Chris followed the other side of the room and then cut through the middle. Eventually, we all made it to the end of the basement, where the sound became quite loud. "Wait," Hans said, holding up a hand. He pulled a bar from something on a nearby post and poked out at the floor. "I've received more than a few questions about how I got into writing horror, and I've realised that perhaps the best answer is also a story itself. I had quite a few run-ins with the inexplicable when I was younger. I always loved scary stories and devoured any horror show I was allowed to watch. This later translated into a subtle disappointment and a feeling of betrayal as I reached my teenage years without personally ever seeing anything terrifying. That changed when we moved. We'd always lived on the East Coast, near the Appalachian Mountains. The mountains were blue on the horizon, and the land was hilly and massively forested. I grew up completely used to wandering in the woods. It was all moderately civilized landscape. That was simply the nature of cities in the foothills. The Midwest was completely the opposite. The American Midwest, at least around here, could probably be characterized best as a dichotomy. Suburbs were built in tight formation, with landscaped lawns and pretty streets. Meanwhile, right outside the outer circle of houses, drawn around the area almost like a wagon train circled for safety, there immediately began completely unkempt forest. In our neighbourhood, we called that abrupt back end to our neighbourhood the edge. Around the age of 14, we fancied ourselves far too old to be scared of anything, but that sudden divide between trimmed civilization and dark forest still fascinated and terrified us. There was a house back there too, a mile or two back. Left over from some past era, it was well known in the neighbourhood as haunted. Besides a purported aura of intense fear it gave off, its primary claim to fame was a strange sound that could only be heard while inside. We resolved to enter that house and figure out once and for all the mystery of that sound. It was 7th grade, and I, having just moved, was in a new school that I hated. My only friends were the other outcasts. There was Hans, the German kid who spoke English with a thick accent, Chris, who was permanently sarcastic and annoying, and our token weird girl, Caitlin, who, according to rumour, picked her nose often, and once ate it. Misfits was an apt term for our group, and then there was me. Too smart for my own good, just cool enough to know how cool I wasn't, and more than a little angry at life in general. I was every teenager ever, now that I think about it. We crept across the edge in the middle of the afternoon. We weren't stupid enough to try it at night. Compared to my old home, the forest itself was different too. Instead of massive old-growth trees with plenty of space underneath and a nice carpet of leaves, this forest was more moderate in height and much more tangled. This was not something a person could just walk around in. Worse, the middle of Ohio was rife with sudden sheer canyons for some ancient geological reason. Our parents had often regaled us with tales of the kids who fell in and died, 1 or 2 a year if their exaggerations were to be believed. So we crept through the tangled underbrush with double apprehension. Passage was annoying enough that once we reached the house, we could have given ourselves excuses and gone home. But we didn't. This was, potentially, our ticket to some measure of popularity. The house sat at an odd angle, surrounded by slightly younger trees and thick undergrowth. 4 holly trees flanked the front, 2 on each side of the main steps. The porch looked disturbingly like a mouth, and the front door sat ajar. We looked at each other for several minutes, daring one another to be the first, until a sudden drizzle forced our collective hand. We sought the porch for shelter from the surprise rain. "Yeah, that makes this way less scary," Chris commented, gazing up at the wall of rain sliding down from the house's roof. The patter of rain on leaves reminded me of home, but the accompanying gloom made the house that much darker. I peered in through the dusty front windows but saw nothing. Caitlin peered in another window, apprehensive. "Boys first." Hans just frowned and pushed the front door. Surprisingly, it swung in without resistance or sound. The interior of the house sat like 2 dark plains above and below a dim haze of dust. The rain outside had the whole place pattering, creaking and breathing. I was rather eloquent back then. This sucks. Nobody argued the point. We crept in at a snail's pace, testing each placed foot as if something might leap out at us at any moment. Once all 4 of us were inside, Hans let the door swing silently shut, and we froze, listening. The ebb and flow of the rain blanketed us with a current of sound. We heard a creak upstairs, and then came a creak near the dust-covered sofa in the room to our left. Riding adrenaline, it almost seemed a good idea to bolt. Before we made the collective decision to leave, there it was. "It's like being at the movies," Caitlin whispered, "and the theatre next to yours starts rumbling and shaking." Her description was the best way to put it. The house vibrated slightly, and a spike in the rumbling actually shook dust from the rafters above. Shaking my head to get the dust out of my hair, I crept forward, following the rumble. The sound brought me to a gaping black door. Of course, the basement. Unhappily, we clustered around the stairs to the basement. Deeper gloom lit the base of the stairs, filtering through from the small basement windows we'd seen from outside. "After you," Chris said. Making a face, I stepped carefully down, testing each wooden board. The structure itself seemed solid, even if I couldn't see it. I kept calm by telling myself they could see my silhouette against the basement's dim light and would get help if they saw me fall. I froze at the base of the stairs. The rumbling was louder here, like distant thunder. I could feel a subtle vibration in my legs whenever the rolling murmur reached a crescendo. I noticed all that subconsciously, but it was what I saw that had me locked in place. Filtering swaths of dusty light fell through countless sharp objects. 3 pitchforks over there, old harvesting equipment with a roll of curved spines across from it, a goddamn bear trap on the wall, rusty shovels, hung machetes, every piece of ancient farm equipment imaginable lay around at unpredictable angles. A hand grabbed my shoulder. "How's it look?" Chris asked, hunched over against the cobwebs we'd passed through. He looked around. "Oh, sneaky." He jumped as Caitlin bumped into him, and Hans came up behind her. "This looks dangerous," Caitlin said. I agreed, but I hated it here, in this city, the whole place. I wasn't about to let some creepy house scare me off, especially not when the danger was completely mundane. As always, I wanted to be scared, wanted to run from a ghost, and I'd always been let down. "We'll just be careful," I said, moving forward. "The sound's closer here. Nobody's ever said anything about this basement, so we know we're further than they've ever been. Let's leave. Take this discovery. It's already good for us," Hans said, concerned. I looked back at him with a glare and shook my head before moving forward again. Caitlin moved past Chris and held onto my shoulder as I moved. "It sounds like the ocean." "Yeah, it does," I replied, wondering if that was significant. I carefully slid around a jagged series of tools that had fallen from a rotting shelf. "But that whole aura of fear thing the other kids talk about, there's none of that. Just this basement full of rusted crap." Working their own way through the expansive, gloomy maze of rusty danger, Hans and Chris followed the other side of the room and then cut through the middle. Eventually we all made it to the end of the basement where the sound became quite loud. "Wait," Hans said, holding up a hand. He pulled a bar from something on a nearby post and poked out at the floor. It fell away suddenly, a 3 or 4 foot gap appearing in the crumbling dirt and rock. The gap had been there already, just slightly less wide, and invisible in the darkness. Now, with the edge crumbling away, we could barely see rain-filtered light down below, and little gushing rivulets of rainwater working their way down what looked like a 100-foot spillway. "It's a cut-through to the gorge," I realised aloud, running through the nearby area's layout in my head. "That's the sound. We're hearing the river." "You think that kid that died fell into the river from here?" Chris asked, snickering. I stared down the hole from as close as I dared. Uneven, lined with boulders and steep drops, the sheer spillway seemed horribly lethal. "Yeah, man. He might have. Died in the fall and then washed fully out by rain sometime later." Chris fell silent at that prospect. Caitlin gripped my shoulder tighter. "Let's go, guys. We've done it. Let's get out of here." I stood tall to say something, and a sudden rush of fear hit me. My heart began pounding faster, and I felt a call to action, as if I was immediately threatened. Caitlin's grip on my shoulder became sharp and painful. "What is that?" Hans asked, his voice shaking. I wasn't scared of anything. There'd been no prompt, no scary sight, no scary sound, and I knew what it was. It was the aura of fear the other kids swore was real. Struggling not to run for fear of the basement's maze of rusted blades and points, I held the others back and peered through the dim haze. "You guys see anything?" I asked, my breathing strained. The fear just kept rising, sharper and sharper, nearing panic. "No," Chris responded, terrified. My body kept screaming at me that something was about to get me, that something was approaching, but I still saw nothing. Underneath the flood of fear, I felt a strange moment of excitement. This was what I'd wanted. I'd wanted to be afraid. Feeling contrary and eager, I closed my eyes, letting the fear surge exponentially. I even smiled for a moment. I opened my eyes, confused. I closed my eyes again. It was there again. I opened my eyes. It was gone again. I closed my eyes, now certain I was seeing the source of the inexplicable fear. I couldn't explain it, but I could only see it while my eyes were closed. Against the total blackness of my own eyelids, a horrible vision approached. It could only be described as a silhouette of monochrome spectral lines, flickering grey against black. Its outline in constant motion, it seemed to flash and jump in place. Clad in ethereal, torn clothes and covered in gaping wounds, neck bones jutting from below a head permanently tilted against its shoulder, the corpse image took slow, shambling steps forward. I opened my eyes and I couldn't see it anymore. By my best guess, it was halfway across the basement and moving toward us. "Jesus Christ, close your eyes," I whispered. "No!" the other 3 kids shouted in unison. "Do it!" I shouted back. They did, and I could see their strained control failing. The inexplicable fear had already been almost too much, but once they saw the thing coming for us... "We have to go," I said, feeling out of my own head. It was finally happening. I'd finally seen the supernatural, felt it, and the fear seemed to eliminate every other emotion. All I had left was a hammering heart and logic. "It's going to push us in the hole." That threat brought my friends back to clarity for a moment. "Go that way," I said, ordering Chris and Hans to take the other side of the rusted maze. Tears sliding down his face, Hans nodded, and the 2 of them went left. I took Caitlin and went right. Moving too fast, I almost ran bodily into the curled spines I'd seen earlier. Slowly, not daring to breathe, I stepped back. Closing my eyes, I looked for the flickering entity, and it was almost upon us, blocking our way forward. Back the other way at a dangerous pace, I tried the middle path. "Caitlin, where's it going?" She didn't want to close her eyes. "Look, please look." As we inched forward, narrowly avoiding a series of hanging blades, she clung hard to my back and moved her head around. "It's close to Chris," and I heard Hans cry out in pain, but I couldn't look. My eyes were on the bear trap hanging against the wall as we smoothly and slowly moved by it. If it snapped shut from the humidity or our motion or anything, her head cleared the danger area and she never realized what I'd moved her past. "It's coming back this way," she shouted in my ear. Closing my eyes for a look, I saw it reaching out for me and I ducked, crawling forward and dragging Caitlin behind me. Covered in dirt, I reached the stairs, just in time to pull Chris forcibly by the back of his shirt and keep him from falling onto an upright pitchfork. They ran up the stairs, while I paused to close my eyes and look back. The thing leered at me from the middle of the basement, its sideways grin mocking me, as if to say, "You think you've gotten away." I ran then too. Hans had cut his arm, but other than that we escaped unscathed. Our discovery led to a fundraiser by the neighbourhood association, and the house was torn down and the hole filled in the next year. We did win a certain amount of notoriety among the other kids for all that, which led to later explorations and even worse locations, but those are their own stories, although I never told my friends what I'd seen in that last glance back. It was also the genesis of my interest in writing horror. There's more to this world than randomness and unfounded fears in the dark. If I hadn't been a perverse fear-seeker in that moment and closed my eyes, I might not be here today. I think it's important we honour the eons-old tradition of sharing scary stories because there are kernels of truth in these stories, and the strategies within might one day help someone escape from a horrible fate. Because as that mocking glance told me, that ghastly thing had a will, a mind, and it was intelligent. I saw the elegance of the strategy in that moment. It made people afraid on purpose. Afraid people look around, they keep their eyes wide, and they don't close them. Remember that. Next time you feel afraid of the dark for no reason, your instinct to look around, your instinct to stare at the darkness in fear, may be exactly what something is counting on. Prior to writing this all out, I never really suspected a possible connection with the incident at the house, but I stopped sleeping right around that time. From 7th grade until my junior year of college, I would continue to stay up late every single night and sleep horribly if I slept at all. The culprits were many: video games, a newfound love of soda, a rising undercurrent of hatred for school, which felt increasingly like a prison, and a strong appreciation for the quiet void of the night. I often walked my neighbourhood at night and sometimes dared to venture into the nearby woods. The area was very safe, and the neighbourhood association had recently built nice paths, steps and boardwalks that went all the way down to the river, so sneaking out to walk around was more a product of boredom than any sort of fear-seeking. It was one of those nights, in the early autumn of 9th grade, that I saw something out in the forest. I was no fool. I immediately went home, intent on returning the next day. I actually slept well for once, excited for a Saturday trek to investigate what I'd seen. It had been almost 2 years since the incident at the house, and life was starting to feel agonizingly bland again. I called to get the old band back together, but Hans had since gone back to Germany. Chris arrived first. He seemed hesitant. He'd been a little skittish ever since our encounter at the house. He'd often said he wished it hadn't happened. His sarcasm had quieted in the last 2 years. "I'm not going inside anything," he muttered, without greeting. "No houses, no caves, nothing," I nodded. "That's fine." Caitlin showed up a few minutes later with a broad smile. I'd only seen her once that summer briefly, and she seemed older than I remembered somehow. This was certainly not the same weird girl from middle school. "What did you see?" she asked, excited. "He said it was blue," Chris responded, crossing his arms. "Yeah." I looked at the trail that led into the woods. A dim blue light in the distance, really hard to see, but definitely somewhere down the gorge. It hurt my eyes. She immediately headed for the trail. "Well, let's go then." We followed the easy trail along the left side of the gorge. The cut in the earth was deep and sheer, but there were numerous wooden rails, and this was more a park than wilderness. This was also not the main river, though a heavy creek did flow along the bottom, swelled by recent rains. The path on our side ended rather abruptly. The path on the other side of the gorge continued, accessible by bridge all the way back where we'd started, but it led away, heading toward the main river. "That's it then," Chris said, shrugging, "and can't go further." "Bull," Caitlin responded, sliding through the wooden rail. Chris rushed to the rail. "What are you doing?" I was a little concerned myself. "Look, it's not so steep here. There are roots and dirt, not just rock. It looks like other people go down this," she explained, working her way down. "Older kids probably come here to smoke." I laughed and slid through the rail. The steep dirt was made traversable by a few perfectly placed roots that jutted out like handholds. It was nerve-wracking climbing down, but I never felt in danger. At the worst, if I fell, I would slide down the dirt painfully. "Come on!" I yelled up to Chris. He followed only under protest, as he made abundantly clear for the entire climb down. Once down, I took stock of the surroundings. The gorge was about 50 feet high on either side, blocking out all but the immediate sounds of nature. The narrow dirt slope we'd slid down ended just below an abrupt waterfall basin. While quite beautiful, the waterfall made it impossible to travel that direction. If the creek had been dry, we might have climbed the rock shelf, but for now, it was a loud wall of water spraying us with mist. No matter. I'd seen the strange blue light in the other direction, further down the gorge. I led, and we picked our way downstream, sticking to the sides where dry passage was possible. A few minutes in, a light pattering radiated from above and echoed from the high mossy walls. "No, not again!" Chris shouted. Caitlin and I exchanged glances, both jumping to the same conclusion. The three of us rushed back to the dirt slope we'd come down on, trying to climb back up one at a time, but the drizzle was quickly turning the slope to muddy mush, and our attempts to escape only made it crumble further. Chris looked at me with accusation. "Oh, we're stuck!" he shouted. I shook my head. "We'll just have to walk out. This has to lead to the river eventually, right?" "Yeah," he replied, his voice rising to a trembling shout. "Past the thing." "What thing?" Caitlin asked, unhappy with being covered in mud but otherwise unperturbed. "Whatever thing he found. Whatever's out there, all blue and glowy," he complained. "We should just sit here and wait for someone to come." "What if it gets dark first?" I asked, giving a test shout up at the walls. My own voice echoed back weakly. "They'll never hear us anyway." We had no choice. Sticking close together, we crept forward along old mossy rock. The high wall against my hand made me feel slightly safer. Meanwhile, the rain intensified, adding wet autumn chill to the gorge's naturally chilly air and the creek's spraying mist. My hands grew numb despite my best attempts to warm them, and we all began shivering soon after. "This is the worst thing that's ever happened, ever," Chris muttered. I gave no response, too wary of the gorge ahead. Thick accumulations of leaves carpeted whatever ground the swelled creek didn't cover. Ancient trees towered right up out of the gorge itself, none climbable, but all blocking the scant grey sunlight filtering through the rain clouds. Dark, freezing, possibly haunted. Yeah, Chris was right. This was the worst thing ever. I was loving it. "Hello!" Chris screamed upward. I followed his eager gaze. We could see the back of a house, sitting on a sharp slope near the edge of the gorge. A ramshackle wooden fence seemed scant protection against falling immediately out the back door to one's death. We shouted for a few minutes, but there was no response. Chris went for one last shout at the top of his lungs, and froze. A faint call, a hello, perhaps, barely perceptible, it came from further down the gorge. Chris took 4 eager running steps forward, and froze again. Right, we know how this works. I was as hesitant as he was, but Caitlin moved ahead. "We have no choice," she said flatly, shivering against the freezing drizzle. We moved with caution, trying to scout every possible hiding location, but the tangled undergrowth, huge trees and rushing creek made total certainty impossible. She held onto my shoulder and alternated walking with her eyes closed just in case, but she saw nothing. The rain surged, and it became very difficult to see in the misty gloom. "Hello?" came a distant call, barely audible over the loud roar of the rain. Something sounded off about that voice. We came to an abrupt wall of darkness. Peering at it in dismay, we realized that the thickening trees and narrowing gorge had combined to plunge the area ahead into total blackness. Chris had an expression of regret and fear that I agreed with wholeheartedly, but there was nothing else to do but go through. "Hold on, and don't let go, no matter what," I said, taking the lead. Thunder rumbled overhead as we moved into the darkness. I could hear the creek burbling and flowing to my left, and I could feel the mossy rock to my right, chilly to the touch, the rain roaring above, sometimes dripping on us in thick streams funneled by leaves. "Hello?" The voice was much clearer and had a quick echo behind it, as if whoever had shouted was near the opposite wall of the gorge in the darkness with us. "Is it someone else?" Chris whispered. I squeezed his arm painfully to keep him quiet, and Caitlin's hand squeezed painfully against my shoulder. I looked over. At some indeterminate distance in the pitch black, a little blue orb seemed to coalesce. It was an eerie blue, the kind I'd seen the night before and never elsewhere, the kind I would not see again until years later when an innovative type of LED Christmas light would come out, with new hues that seemed otherworldly to the eye. "Howdy," the voice came again, and the little blue orb rotated. Another orb came into view, this one purple and negative, as if it was some kind of anti-light, painful to behold. They were some sort of eyes. Dim, otherworldly blue and purple floated across the wall of the gorge as those eyes searched, ever so faintly illuminating whatever they looked at. We ducked in unison, hiding behind a large boulder as the bizarre light passed over our spot. "Hey, come check this out," the voice called. The dissonance was intense. The voice sounded like an average young male, possibly a female. It was hard to tell, but it sounded human. The thing began to move, searching further. From the faint light of its eyes, I guessed that it was 6 or 7 feet in height. We slowly circled the rock as it passed, and then bolted further into the black, scrambling and falling and running. The idea was implicit. The dark area had to widen soon, had to reach the river sometime. We just had to get there. We froze together. "Hello." "Howdy." "Hey, come check this out. Spare a dime?" "Hello." A dozen voices sounded in the darkness ahead. We watched a rapid series of eerie blue and anti-purple eyes open in random places, all leering about, searching for us. Their combined light was just enough to see vague outlines. Faintly opaque shadows flowed from beneath their impossible eyes, each vaguely human, ranging from 3 to 5 feet tall. The gorge flashed with a dim menagerie of colour, the display moving closer to us by the moment. "Hello?" It was the first voice from behind us, coming back our way. Crouching in the darkness, numb, freezing, miserable and terrified, it was the perfect time to panic. The only choice was whether we should run back, trying to get past the largest one, or forward, into the darkness, past the dozen smaller ones. I grabbed and ran back, pulling Caitlin along, but Chris darted the other way, tearing out of my grasp as he bolted forward. There was no time. Splashing straight up the slippery creek, stumbling and pressing forward, I received a dozen scrapes and bruises, but "hello" kept calling from behind us, seemingly a little closer each time, even as we ran at full speed. The rain had become a torrential downpour by the time we reached the mud slope and the base of the shelf waterfall. We tried to climb up, but spilling water made it impossible, and our hands were numb besides. Rolling thunder mocked our shouts for help. Thinking quickly, Caitlin used the water to scrape the mud away with her hand, exposing sharp rocks and more of the roots. Able to grip them at the cost of cuts and scrapes, we worked our way up, constantly looking back for the strange eyes and the parroted human calls, but we seemed to have lost it. That climb was far more dangerous than the climb down, and I thought that I might fall and break bones at any time. But we made it. We ran along the edge, staying well away for fear the rain would sweep us over, or that loose rock might collapse. We could have gone the other way, running for home, but Chris was still down there. We passed over the dark area. From this angle, it seemed wholly unnatural. The dim rain-filtered light seemed to just stop somewhere in the air below. She screamed down periodically as we ran. "Chris!" We left the unnatural dark area behind, following the canyon as it widened. We could see the river in the distance. "Right here, guys," we heard Chris yell from halfway up the gorge wall. Caitlin ran for the sound of his voice, and abruptly choked on her jacket as I pulled her hood with all my might. Dangling over a sudden cleft that dropped away to sharp rocks, she flailed her arms. She carefully angled her feet in the slippery mud and pushed back, recovering with my help. Stunned, she backed away. This was almost the same fate we'd escaped once before. "Right here, guys!" the Chris voice yelled again. "Right here, guys!" Her jaw trembling, she leaned over and looked. I peered over too. At first, we saw nothing, but a few moments passed and the thing must have realized the deception had failed. Blue and purple lights appeared, gazing up at us for a moment, and then a vague, shadowy, huge form moved away. Caitlin gagged. The thing was dragging a brutally bloodied mess of flesh. I shook her arm. "It's a deer," I whispered. Peering through the driving rain, I could just see Chris's blue jacket in the distance, stomping through water at the mouth of the gorge and waving his arms frantically at someone. He'd made it. "Go get him," I told her, "and make sure he's all right." Confused, she argued for a moment, but then did as I asked. I headed back down the edge of the gorge alone, finding the inexplicable dark zone. Lying on my stomach in the mud, I crept up and peered over the edge. Just like the ghost thing from the house, I had to look back. I had to know. Illuminated by faint ghastly eyelight, I watched the dozen smaller forms throw pieces of the deer about, noisily fighting and consuming bits of it with glee. My gaze travelled past them as I realised that I was being watched in turn. The largest form sat by itself, its blue and purple eyes on me. Without looking away from me, it tore a leg from the deer carcass and threw it to the others. A minute later, the darkness seemed to swirl, mixing about like a fog. The entire area of blackness cleared between blinks, and I found myself staring down at trees, leaves, and water. Natural gorge, indistinguishable from anywhere else on our path, if not for the deer bones. Lying stark white and picked clean, they were scattered about with abandon, some shattered for their marrow. Lying in the mud, rain running down my face, struggling to comprehend everything that had just happened. I had the strangest notion I'd just witnessed a family rest stop. The school Halloween came soon after our incident at the gorge, and the season was a fantastic one for me. I'd been inspired. The flickering ghost at the house could have just been a once-in-a-lifetime encounter, but the strange beings passing through the gorge near our neighbourhood proved that the supernatural was real. It was my dream as a horror fan, and now a spinner of my own tales come true. My position as a high school freshman seemed to be rising. I wasn't integrated into any groups per se, but became more of a freelance, known for a heavy soda habit and telling intense, scary stories. My reputation and subtle distance from everyone else suited me just fine. High school was just this white-walled place I went for 8 hours a day. It was not just an allegory for prison, it was a prison. I was bored out of my mind most of the time, and thoroughly enjoyed messing with people through horror stories. The Halloween season made them extra vulnerable to fear. I wasn't sure where things would go once the season passed and scary stories fell out of favour, but I was having fun with it until, out of nowhere, Caitlin suddenly started dating a soccer player. Chris and I were not speaking. We'd had a falling out after the incident at the gorge. He'd been depressed and morose ever since. That left Caitlin and me briefly, until Josh entered the picture. I hadn't even been aware she talked to anyone from the sports crowd, let alone found them interesting enough to date one. My stories took on a darker, angrier tone. I also joined the soccer team mid-season, although I literally had no idea how to play. I wasn't extremely terrible for a freshman, but my presence certainly irked Josh. I more than made my dislike clear. Our rivalry reached a breaking point in November, near the end of the soccer season. The final encounter began after a soccer practice ended. Most everyone else had gone home, but I still lingered in the school's front hall, resting up for the walk home. Chris stumbled through the main doors, shoved from behind. Josh came in behind him, followed by 2 of his cronies, and Caitlin. I frowned at her, and she gave a concerned expression of apology. "Chris here says it's you," Josh accused, doing his best to tower over me. I glared back at him, not about to back down from his attempted intimidation. "What's me?" "I've heard all about your little stories," he responded, his tone mocking. "Caitlin talks you up all the time, but Chris here, he says they're real, that it's you. You've convinced these 2 that your stories are real." Chris shoved away Josh's grip and grimaced at me. "Sorry, but what I said was, I just think sometimes you tell stories that are too real. People can get confused." Though I didn't show it, I felt a little dismayed. But if that was what Chris had to believe to feel better about the encounters, I guess I couldn't blame him. Josh interrupted. "I'm just tired of everyone listening to you like you're somebody. You're just a freshman. You're nobody." He stepped even closer. "So let's hear it. Scare us. Find us a real ghost, or make us believe some story. I don't think you can do it." His aim was to embarrass me in front of Caitlin, that much was obvious, but I'd had it with his crap and I was already full of anger and resentment from too many other things. I stared him down. "All right. Don't..." Chris began to plead, but Josh shoved him aside. I took in a slow breath and closed my eyes. The story-spinning craft I'd been developing had fine-tuned my awareness. Horror seemed empowered by details, by surroundings, and the environment. I was constantly aware of little sounds or certain spaces. I pulled these things to me, collecting them, testing them against a taut string in my chest. My sense of fear, which I'd learned to adjust to mimic my audience's reactions. I opened my eyes, a little confused. More than a few times, I'd sensed gaps in the world around me. Certain spots gave off what could only be described as nothing. They were emotionally blank. This sensation threw me off and disrupted my sharp anger. Shaking my head, I walked slowly down the hall, feeling the fear reaction in me start up again, rising as I walked. I followed it like a dowsing rod. "Where's he going?" one of Josh's friends asked. "Shut up, man. Just follow him." It sounded as if, at least for the moment, Josh was actually engaged. They walked behind me as I felt myself led to the school library. Uncertain about what was happening, I grabbed a book from the quiet shelves. The library felt strange without anyone inside it, lit only by dim November afternoon light filtering through the windows. Following my lead, they each grabbed a book. I sat at a table in the middle of the room. They sat on either side of me, forming a long row. Josh made sure to sit next to me, a snide look on his face. I raised the book to my face, blocking most of my forward vision. They did the same, confused. One of the guys laughed. Chris looked pained, while Caitlin on the other side of Josh seemed excited. What was I doing? Where was this going? With each action, the responsive fear in me had grown a little stronger. Why was the dim, empty library filling me with fear? I felt around the logic of the room with my mind. Attracted by the active imagination, it approaches slowly. It uses an angle visually blocked by the book itself. It depends on the reader being immersed and absorbed. They quieted, suddenly aware that none of us could see forward. So far, it has been content with keeping a low profile, by restricting itself to subtly draining the victim's psyche and will. It leaves them tired and sore after a few hours, even though they were just sitting there reading. You might recognize that feeling. The body's normal defense mechanism is a periodic look around with an inexplicable sense of something amiss. Josh frowned. His two friends exchanged glances. A rising sense of vulnerability overtook the group. I could tell they wanted to drop their books and look. That periodic momentary awareness sends it running for a time, preventing serious mental damage. But now, 6 potential victims at the same table are ignoring that impulse, keeping their books up, refusing to answer their fear, and it begins to wonder, do these 6 know? It begins to feel threatened. It begins to wonder if it should use its precious energy to lash out at one. But which one? It flickers closer, approaching the back of one of the books. Caitlin tensed. Chris looked extremely unhappy. I could feel the group's emotions rising to a sharp point as the overpowering sense of something approaching behind our books became unbearable. I thought I could even hear the barest hint of something winding up, preparing to strike. Josh slammed his book on the table, loudly disrupting the moment. Although he seemed subtly shaken, he put on a show of anger. "This is crap. There's nothing here. It's the school library. Come on." We lowered our books. I looked around, eyes narrowed. The rising note of fear had flitted away, reduced to a subtle lurking tension somewhere distant. "Look," Josh continued, "if you can't deliver, fine." I stood. Filled with anger, I slammed a hand flat on the table. "But you asked for it." Imbuing the taut sense in my heart with a surge of fire and dark intent, I followed it out of the library and into the hall. It led us quickly to the large open gymnasium. Shrouded in darkness, the windowless space arched over us, a chill flowing void lit only by a spike of light from the hallway doors. "So there's 2 hauntings in the school?" Josh asked, unimpressed. I shook my head. The horrible floating thing in the library didn't feel like a ghost. I think they're quite numerous, but content to remain subtle and unseen, feeding on the minds of unsuspecting readers. I think the worst thing that could happen with those is looking up without warning and accidentally seeing one, unless you frighten it, and it lashes out. I drank in the sensations of the gym's vast blackness and quiet, comparing the texture to that first encounter in that house's basement. And this doesn't feel like a ghost either. This is something else. I didn't mention the anger I felt reflected back at me. Chris shook his head, highly unhappy, but Josh pushed him along with us. We began trekking across the gym, sinking deeper into inky darkness. Our shoes echoed weirdly against the smooth floor, squealing occasionally. Nervous laughter made a round through the group as it became harder to see one another. Our pace slowed as the darkness grew nearly complete. I could only see them out of the corner of my eye, and we began stumbling forward, wondering when the opposite wall of the gym would suddenly bump into us. "We're not supposed to be here," Chris moaned. "We'll never reach the—" We came up against the opposite wall. Oh, Caitlin looked back. Does that seem really far away to you? Indeed, the two tiny squares of light in the hallway doors seemed oddly small and distant. The others were only the barest silhouettes in the corner of my vision. It's just a dark gym, Josh said dismissively. The darkness out there set the sense inside me vibrating with an almost physical force. I felt uneasy. It wasn't the trees ahead that were the problem. Turning around, I gazed through the back window with dismay. The eerie red light from my brake lights illuminated thick trees behind us too. What? Nicole asked. He just pulled off the road because you're being a Stay in the car, Caitlin interrupted, opening her door slowly. Why? Nicole began to ask. Caitlin hissed at her. Stay in the goddamn car. Don't go out there, Chris breathed, but she didn't listen. I opened my door and stepped out as well, leaving my fancy dress jacket inside. Where are we? She asked, looking over the roof at me. I shook my head. I didn't know. Old-growth trees surrounded us, but an open carpet of leaves ran under them, completely devoid of the tangled undergrowth that should have been there. This forest was more like the ones I remembered from my previous home on the East Coast, filled with thick, ancient trees that made undergrowth impossible. Even worse, the road was nowhere to be seen. Caitlin held her hand up, feeling the light rain that filtered through a gap in the trees high above. Further out, we could hear heavier drops of accumulated water falling from leaves. The sound came from all around us, audible over the grumbling of my car's engine. So what? She demanded. Is this some parallel nightmare reality? Or did we go back in time or something? What did you do? I don't know, I shot back, my anger slowly turning into an uncontrollable smile as I thought about it. Despite myself, I couldn't help but laugh. But that would be freaking awesome. Her cheeks shot up around a sudden massive grin. It would be, wouldn't it? Chris emerged from the car, glaring darkly at the two of us. What's so funny? Nicole popped her door open and completed the over-the-roof circle of conversation. What's going on? Where's the road? I peered into the darkness, able to discern a few outlines, dark against black. Looks like there's a hill over there, so we should go climb it and look for the road. Yeah, Caitlin added, excited. Let's go off into the woods. I suppose we should split up too, Chris groaned. Nicole glared at him. Hell no. I pulled the keys out, silencing my car but leaving the lights on. Fighting down a constant grin born of excitement at my own fear, I led the way between the trees sticking to the long beam from my car's headlights. Without the rumbling sound from the engine, the forest became much louder, radiating the sound of shifting leaves, falling drops, and an occasional unexplained snap or crack from somewhere in the darkness. Each scary sound had Nicole gripping my arm. I felt quite manly for as long as the headlights lasted, but the beams faded with distance, and we were forced to let our eyes adjust before moving into pitch darkness. My only hope was that some sort of road would be visible from up the slope, lit by streetlights or buildings or something. Something snapped to our left. I had sudden flashbacks to the pitch-black gymnasium, and waiting in terrified silence as something horrible crept up near my face. I had the sudden urge to abandon the trek to the hill and run back to the car, but we'd still be stuck in the middle of unknown forest. Chris, just watch our left, I ordered, creeping forward into the darkness. Caitlin, watch the right. Nicole, scream if you see anything. Weird. She squeezed my arm harder. I was planning on it. As I grew used to the darkness, I found myself barely able to make out forms and shapes, lit by the barest moonlight filtering through clouds and canopy. I had to keep moving my head from side to side, using the corners of my vision to detect the slightest changes in dark and black. Chris backed up against me. Jesus Christ! We looked to the left as a group. I saw nothing strange at first, until I noticed a distinct branch resting at an odd angle. It was noticeably bright red, even in the dark, and rather rotted. I tilted my head, curious. It moved, disappearing behind a tree. I grabbed Nicole's mouth to muffle her scream. It had been a leg. "Back to the car," Chris hissed through clenched teeth. "No," I replied, making the hard call. "Forward, just run." They listened, and we ran as a group. The flat landscape, covered in wet leaves, made for easy running, and even easier slipping. Several times someone fell, and we hurriedly picked them up and continued running. The sounds of snapping nearly matched us, slowly falling behind, now including a strange hissing, breathing sound. The ground's angle turned up and we pounded up, reaching the crest of the hill. Lights, Caitlin pointed. She was right. Off in the distance, we could see an unidentifiable building and a brightly lit gas station, and a road. The hill led back down and we ran at full speed until I noticed gaps on the horizon to our left and right. The chilly wind tipped the rest of the group off. "No," Chris shouted. "A river! No!" A wide, flat, murmuring black plain lay between us and the distant gas station. A dozen crackling and breathing sounds came from several places in the woods behind us. "I can't swim," Nicole said, depressed. "You can't?" Caitlin asked, a note of panic in her voice. Nicole sighed. "It'll ruin my dress." Caitlin's concern dropped to a flat, stony expression. "I'll fix that." She bent down, scooped up some mud and threw it at the squealing girl. "Problem solved. Now get in the river." Heart pounding, I followed Nicole's terrified shrieks into the water, and Caitlin and Chris splashed in after me. The ice-cold water brought pain and a certain irresistible terror. I never liked swimming in anything that wasn't a pool, because I'd always imagined horrible things in the deep waiting for a chance to grab my legs. But there was no choice now. Struggling to stay as high up in the icy black as I could, I swam after Chris and Caitlin, who had passed me during my initial hesitation. A low sound similar to a chuckle flowed over me from behind. Unable to resist the urge, I looked back. Silhouettes of misshapen, rotting things slid under the water from the shore, pursuing us from the woods. I couldn't be sure, but they looked like mauled corpses, moving in impossible, ungainly ways, mostly an assortment of animals, but one vaguely human. The split skull of the humanoid sank beneath the black plane of the water, staring at me with a rotted, horrible grin. I had the distinct impression that it somehow knew my unreasonable fear of the water, and it was more than eager to make it come true. "Go, go," I shouted ahead, splashing after the others. Truly completely terrified for the first time in my life, I fought my numbing limbs to swim as fast as I could, cursing my restrictive dress clothing. There was no way to know whether the horrible rotting things were catching up to us in the water. Ahead of the three of us, Nicole screamed. Tiring and only halfway across, we swam up to the spot where she thrashed and struggled. "My leg!" she shouted. I dove under while Chris and Caitlin tried to keep her from being pulled under. The freezing shock against my face almost had me breathe in water, but I fought against it and fought my keening terror to swim down. I could feel rushing emptiness all around me, the dark and chill increasing below into unknown depths. Fingers. It was fingers. A bony, slimy hand had a grip on her ankle. Surging with adrenaline, I did the only thing I could think of. I gripped 2 fingers in each hand and pulled apart. The hand ripped in half. I could feel the rotting flesh giving way, sinew by sinew. Nicole kicked away, and I thrashed for the surface. Hey friends, thank you for listening to today's story. Make sure to click the notification icon to stay updated on all future narrations. I release new videos twice every day at 10 AM and 8 PM Eastern Time. If you have a story to share, please send it to the email displayed on the screen. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like and leave an encouraging comment. It really helps me keep bringing you more narrations like this. If you'd like to support the channel even more, you can get early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.